right, hello everyone. I'm excited to be here. My name is Justin Milano, and I'm a co-founder and executive coach at Good Culture. So thanks so much. So I've got the post-lunch speaking slot, and I'm going to talk about something that most of us don't want to talk about, which is founder well-being and mental health. Although there was a conversation that got struck up before lunch, I was pretty excited to see that. It's a good segue into what we're going to be talking about. All right, so just to preface this talk here, I just want to warn you guys that what I'm going to do is the first part of the presentation, I'm going to go into some places that we don't often like to talk about so much. I'm going to kind of go down the entrepreneurial roller coaster to the places where most people don't like to talk about where they're at. And so by halfway through this presentation, you might be thinking, Suze, why the hell did you bring Justin to this event? This is not much fun at all. But I promise you that by the end of this talk, we will go back up again, and we're going to cover what we call the 3 mindsets for exponential growth and well-being for entrepreneurs. So to get started, I want to highlight this article, The Psychological Price of Entrepreneurship. I'm not sure if any of you guys have actually read this article, but Inc. magazine is one of the top entrepreneurial publications in the world, and this is one of the most read articles in the history of the magazine. Okay, so the subhead says a lot. It says, no one said building a company was easy, but it's time to be honest about how brutal it really is and the price that so many founders secretly pay. So obviously the founder sitting here in the fetal position in the bed says a lot. And you'll see that the article was shared over 123,000 times, probably by the significant others of the founders trying to, talk about the challenges that they face being in relationship with founders. But anyway, so what the article was talking about was there was an investor in the article named Brad Feld from Colorado. And he talked about both as an entrepreneur and also as an investor some of the major challenges that he was having with anxiety and depression. Right? So we talked about the fear, the stress, the time scarcity, the burnout, the co-founder conflict, all of these things that founders are going through behind the scenes that no one really talks about so much. Right? And of course, as angel investors, this is affecting the performance of your portfolios. When we talk about startup failure, most times people always say, hey, we didn't find product market fit, the market timing wasn't right, we didn't have the right team members, those kind of things. But behind the scenes, a lot of the reasons why founders can't sustain and find product market fit and get their company to the next level is because of these massive challenges that they're experiencing behind the scenes that they're not going to share so openly with you guys. Okay, so this was a really important article that brought some attention to this. And you might be saying, well, hey, that's for founders who are struggling. They're not doing so well. They're having trouble getting to their next financing rounds. However, though, several weeks ago, Elon Musk comes out with this tweet. And here's, arguably the top founder in the world today. And he talks about his experience of being an entrepreneur. The reality is great highs, terrible lows, and unrelenting stress. Don't think people want to hear about the last two. And so what this tweet led to was a discussion. People were actually asking him openly, are you bipolar? And he said, well, not medically, but that's kind of what my life feels like as a founder and CEO. So you actually, Chris, asked a great question earlier. Are founders, more predisposed to having mental health issues? The answer is actually yes. There's a certain mindset to entrepreneurs that leads them into this crazy world of entrepreneurship. And then the conditions that we operate in are actually exacerbating those conditions significantly. So it's a really important question that you asked. So I'm up here. I've been an entrepreneur for 13 years. So I've gone through the experience myself. I've also been coaching people for the last 7 years around the world. And my co-founder is the former director of well-being at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. So he's one of the top emotion psychologists in the world. And so at Good Culture, in addition to doing leadership development and kind of your standard development of companies, we do kind of tackle this issue around founder and leadership well-being. And we've been asked into a lot of panels. So 500 startups, the Global Accelerator Network, they've had us on these calls, and they're asking about, what's causing all of this incredible suffering that's going on behind the scenes in entrepreneurship? What's at the root of all this? And we didn't really want to answer it, but now we actually have research. We've built assessment technology. We've measured over 1,000 entrepreneurial companies. And through our assessments, we're not just looking at kind of high-level questions. We're really digging into the psychology of entrepreneurship and the well-being of the people, and we've discovered some key patterns. There was a recent study here in New Zealand. They've talked about 96% of people, this was a study done by BizDojo. 96% of entrepreneurs were experiencing mental health challenges. And we started looking at, well, what is the cause of that? And they were saying, okay, well, they're afraid they're not going to have enough money from fundraising, blah, blah. So I want to bring that up because what I'm going to go through today is not the conscious level reasons for the suffering. We can all say, hey, I don't have a lot of time. I'm working my ass off all day. Okay, it's tough to get funding in this environment. You can kind of point to all these surface level issues. But what we're going to focus on today, what we're going to go through, is the deeper issues, the stuff that lives in our subconscious mind. Our subconscious mind is responsible for 90% of our behavior. So it's really important that we don't just look at this from a surface level, that we look at this from the true level of what's causing this. Okay? So this is what we call the triangle of entrepreneurial suffering. By no means is it just these three things that are causing this, but this is one particular pattern that we've noticed throughout all of our research. Let's say working with entrepreneurs, but also in our research, that's causing a lot of this suffering that's going on behind the scenes. So one of them is identifying with your company. Okay, so how many founders do we know that think that they are their company? Right? I am Elon Musk, I'm Tesla. I'm Jeff Bezos, I'm Amazon. Right? I'm Mark Zuckerberg, I'm Facebook. I'm Justin, I'm Good Culture. Right? So we birth something, we found something into the world, and then we think we are that thing. Okay, that we are the company. So what that does is it sets us up for some challenges, right? Because the entrepreneurial roller coaster is never going to stop. If you're waiting for the entrepreneurial world to be less chaotic, you're going to be waiting a really long time. Right? So when you go through those natural lows in the entrepreneurial cycle, if that is a direct reflection of you as a human being, that is going to cause a lot of psychological suffering. It means every time you go through a challenge that has something to do with you, your own self-value, your own worth. And you can see how that would cause some challenges. Now, the second thing we noticed in our research is this unhealthy relationship with anxiety. Right? So every single week is the big unknown as an entrepreneur. Okay, will I have enough money? Can I hold on to these team members? Will this new product or service work? One of our advisors is a top VC in Chicago, and they did a study on 100 founders in their portfolio, and they were looking for, hey, we give you capital, we give you strategy, we give you connections, what aren't we supporting you with? And the number one thing that came up, Sunday night. Being a founder or a CEO up on a Sunday night, looking at all the things in the week ahead and going, oh my God. It's the complete unknown, right? So what really causes our anxiety and our fear is that we're trying to control uncontrollable outcomes. Right? We live in a world where there's 7 billion people and there's trillions of interactions that are going on every single day to create this thing called life that we all experience. And we like to think that we're the master of that and that we can control how it's all going to happen. So when we're trying to control things and then things don't show up the way that we have them desired in our minds, what happens? We experience lots of anxiety. Right? So entrepreneurs are trying to control a certain way of doing things and how things are going to show up in the world. So when we have an unhealthy relationship with our anxiety, that causes a lot of psychological suffering. And then finally, here's the number one blind spot across all of our research. So we've studied founders throughout the United States, Latin America, Oceania here in New Zealand, also in Asia. So founders all across the world. And the number one blind spot in our entire research is around self-beat-up. So beating ourselves up for our mistakes and failures. And again, these are things that we don't necessarily do overtly out in front of the public. These are things that often are going on inside. Right? Something challenging happens with the company, and again, we think it's a direct reflection of us. So what do we start to do? We start to beat the crap out of ourselves. So that lack of self-compassion, that really wears you down. So this particular triangle here, we're going to go into it a little bit deeper. This is causing some deeper level suffering that needs to be addressed in order for entrepreneurs to be able to really thrive. So let's talk about this identification thing, right? So when we talk about identification, what we're saying is that any time you say, I am blank, you create certain attachments, right? So when you say, I am my company, or I am the next game-changing leader, how many of you guys have an entrepreneur that's positioned themselves as the next game changer, the next Mark Zuckerberg, the next whoever, right? So as soon as they create that image and that identity in your minds and the minds of their team members, and most importantly themselves, then what has to happen? The company then needs to live up to that identity. You get attached to things being a certain way. Okay, and when those attachments get threatened, what does it do? It causes a lot of fear, and it causes a lot of anxiety, And then it also affects our decision making, which is one of our most important skill sets as entrepreneurial leaders. So to understand how you identify, even me saying I'm an executive coach up here, requires me to show up and be a certain way in the world, right? In order for you guys to meet that expectation, right? So it's okay to identify, but it's just really important to understand that when we have all of these identities, they create a lot of unconscious requirements for how we need to be showing up, and then we're trying to wrestle with and kind of maintain those and control those throughout our day-to-day life, which again creates anxiety. Now, underneath all of that, what's the emotion that is fueling this whole I am my company? It's actually arrogance. I told you guys we're going to talk about some things none of us want to talk about. These are the sides of ourselves, we call them our shadow sides, right? This is the kind of the dark side of our reality. So if you believe that your company is all about you, it's actually a form of arrogance. And when you operate with that sense of arrogance, what it does is it leads to very self-centered behaviors where you're constantly comparing yourself to others and you're needing to be the best. How many founders we know have to be the best, right? So that's very much rooted in arrogance, but again, this causes major psychological suffering. Okay, now let's talk about the unhealthy relationship with anxiety. This is what they call in psychology the chronic threat cycle. Okay, so what happens is that fear is actually just an in-the-moment response to a present danger. So if you walk outside and a car comes at you at 100 kilometers an hour, it would be your fear to tell you to get the hell out of the way. That's actually really useful. It helps us survive as human beings. Anxiety is the fear of future fear. We worry about things happening in the future that may or may not happen. Right? So again, you're sitting up on a Sunday night and you're going, oh my God, what happens if I run out of money? Oh my God, what happens if my co-founder quits? That may or may not happen, so you can stir around your mind for days or months worried about all of these things. So as all of these anxieties continue to compound, what happens is you start to mentally and emotionally burn out. So this is one of the top reasons for entrepreneurial failure is burnout. Then once you burn out, you start to feel depressed. And then once you start to feel depressed, the world looks very overwhelming, and round you go. Okay, so that article, The Psychological Price of Entrepreneurship, what did it talk about? The anxiety, the burnout, the depression, the overwhelm that all the entrepreneurs are experiencing behind the scenes. So one of the real culprits at the foundation of all of this is our relationship to anxiety. Anxiety is actually a really helpful, useful thing. It helps us anticipate challenges in the future to be able to react to them. But what happens is that as human beings, we don't like the feeling of anxiety. We keep pushing it aside. We want to act like it's not there. We chug the caffeine. We drink the alcohol. We keep suppressing it. But the problem is it doesn't go away until you really hear it and listen to it and receive its wisdom. So there's a difference between having a healthy relationship with anxiety and an unhealthy relationship. One of them leads to feeling well and thriving each day. The other one leads to burnout and depression. Okay, so really important to understand that. So now what's fueling our anxiety? It's the emotion greed. Okay, so this is actually a really, really cool fact, but our desires and our anxieties are perfect mirrors of one another. So think about this. You can't actually have one without the other. The second that you say, I want to succeed at something, you create an equal condition for, I'm afraid of failing. They can't exist without each other. The stronger the desire to succeed, the bigger the fear of failure. Okay, as soon as someone sends an email to you guys as an investor to raise capital, they have a strong desire to raise capital to be able to fulfill their dreams. They also have an equal fear of what happens if I don't get the capital and my dreams fall apart. Okay, so the stronger our desires, the more greed we have, the more that we want, the more our anxieties are going to show up. Okay, so this anxiety at the root of it, there's a kind of a subconscious belief system that there's not enough time, not enough money, not enough bandwidth, not enough support, not enough, not enough, not enough. Right? This is what entrepreneurs live in this environment, and this leads to anxious and fear-based behaviors like greed, hoarding, and self-centeredness and self-absorption. Okay, so again, I know this is heavy. I know you guys don't like me right now. You're going, oh my God, Suze, why did you have Justin talk about all this, right? But anyways, I just want to kind of make sure we go through all that. And then the final thing I wanted to mention on the triangle of entrepreneurial suffering is this results from our research, which I mentioned earlier, around self-compassion being the #1 blind spot. And that's our negative self-talk and believing others' stories about ourselves. And the emotion that is fueling our self-beat-up is actually pride. And it comes from low self-confidence. It comes from being really hard on ourselves, right? So when we're really hard on ourselves, this creates a loneliness and a mental suffering behind the scenes that no one wants to talk about, and that subconscious tendency towards unworthiness. right? It leads us to more prideful behaviors, where we want to start inflating our own sense of power, stepping on others. You become more of a tyrant, right? You need to feel more powerful. So maybe a good example of that might be the President of the United States, right? You would think, here's somebody that needs to kind of inflate his sense of power and grandiosity. That's not coming from a place of strength. It's actually coming from this kind of deeper sense of not really feeling a wholeness and a perfection of who he is. Right? So when we start to understand these things at a deeper level, we can see why our leaders are reacting and responding and making decisions the way that they are. Okay, so now let's flip the switch here and let's go to the other side, the 3 mindsets for exponential growth. I told you guys I'm going to bring it back up again. I can feel the energy in the room. I'm like, oh man, this is tough. After lunch, we got to go through all that stuff, but no one wants to look at this stuff, right? All right, so what are the antidotes? Okay, so when it comes to talking about your company, I am my company, of course the antidote to that is really seeing that your company is far bigger than you. Right, so the second that you bring on investors, you have team members that are dedicating their lives to your mission, you're realizing that you're working on something that has an impact on society that's going to have ripples for decades, right, if not centuries, depending upon what you're working on. When you start to operate from that feeling of humility and seeing that your company is far bigger than you and you are simply a vessel to be of service in the world, that really reduces all of that suffering. Okay, that's a much grander way to look at the work that you're doing in the world, a much more inspirational way that opens you up to doing what's right for your company. When it comes to anxiety, the antidote to that is a context of selfless service. So you're no longer afraid of the constant uncertainty and challenges. Right? You wake up every day and you're not trying to control how everything needs to occur. Instead, you're waking up and saying, how can I be of best service today? What's actually happening? What's real? How do I need to adapt? Where does this want to go? What do my customers want? How can I actually be of greatest service to my customers as opposed to being stuck in what I think they should want? So this context of selfless service, one of the things I find helpful is waking up every day and saying, how can I be of greatest service today? And often being surprised at how that shows up. It's oftentimes far different than the way we think our days are going to go. So this really is a huge antidote to anxiety because you're no longer trying to control reality. You're actually working with reality and seeing the universe as a friendly place that's conspiring for you to learn and grow and be of service to other people. That's what it's all about. And then finally, as far as self-beat-up and the self-compassion we talked about earlier, this is actually one of the top skills. So Google teaches growth mindset as the #1 skill set for all of their high performers that are making the leap to being leaders and managers. So with a growth mindset, this is based on the research of Carol Dweck out of Stanford. Basically what you see is that the whole, everything's about learning and growing. That it's, mistakes, failures, these things are all natural parts of the journey, and that it's simply an opportunity to learn and grow and get better at what you're doing, and not to sit there and beat the crap out of yourself, but instead focus on what needs to be learned and how I can grow from it. So you really embrace challenges and you don't see it as a reflection of you and your own self-worth. Okay, so we'll go a little deeper into this. So again, bigger than me, you are not your company. Okay, this is actually a really important thing to say to founders, especially if they're on the verge of failure, which is, your company may fail, but that does not make you a failure as a human being. It's really important to uncouple those. Okay, so that's one thing you guys can do, which is of great service to your entrepreneurs as investors, is help them realize you're taking a shot on something that can be really important for the world, and that you really believe in them, but you know what? Odds are they're probably going to fail. And that if that happens, that doesn't mean that they're a failure as a human being. Okay, so again, I mentioned before, it's okay to identify, but just realize that all of these identities we create for ourselves, they come with hidden expectations. And if we can understand those hidden expectations, we can actually cut off our anxiety at its source. Okay, so what's the emotion that's fueling the bigger than me? It's the humility. It's freedom from your own self-importance. Okay, we all like to think we're far more important than what we actually are. There's 7 billion of us, okay? We're a little speck of dust on this earth in this massive infinite universe. And our actual time span of our lives is so small in comparison to the age of this universe, right? We are so tiny and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. We're here to serve something much bigger than us. When we operate from that place, we see more possibilities, we're more creative, we're more innovative, we come from a place of awe. Everything's really cool and awesome when you come from that mindset and that context. Okay, and of course, you come from a service type of mindset. Now, on the anxiety side, I hear a lot of investors and people talk about, well, hey, I think some of my best performing entrepreneurs are the most self-centered, right, ego-based, like trying to prove their own self and grandiosity. That really drives them in really powerful ways, right? But actually, that's gotten us really far as a species, for sure. But unfortunately, it's time for us to really change that. If you've got a world of people that are operating from, how is this good for me? We create the world of business and the environment that we live in today where everything is really quite challenging. Right, our whole earth is being destroyed in major ways. So the way we're currently doing business, this kind of self-service way, it needs to shift. Right, so when we're operating from a place of ego and fear-based motivations, we're actually operating in a more limited part of our brain. It's the limbic part of our brain that's responsible for our survival. Right, so the limbic part of our brain is responsible for four things. Fight or flight, so fear, food and fornication. Food, sex, and fear. Right? It's a very primal part of our brain to keep us alive as a species. We need food, we need to procreate, we need to get away from predators, right? So when we're operating in fear-based mindsets, we're operating from more primal parts of our brain. We're not operating from the cortex and the prefrontal cortex, where we're able to think, interpret, create, innovate, see new possibilities, and again, operate from this highest level of psychological development, which is that I'm here to have a sense of meaning to my life, to bring service to other people and support society. If we have a bunch of leaders operating from that particular mindset and context, we are far more powerful as a species and as business. So it's really important that we make this evolutionary leap. And if we do that also, it really takes away our anxieties. And so what's fueling the selfless service is a feeling of generosity. It's a feeling of abundance and enough. We're connected to all living beings on our planet. We see the universe as a friendly place that's always conspiring for us. And we start to lead to things like philanthropy, impact mindsets, how do I improve my community, greater leadership resilience, more time. The benefits are just extraordinary. So all of these things lead to great psychological well-being when you're operating from that context. And then finally, here's the growth mindset. So one thing I really love to highlight about growth mindset is that if you're beating yourself up for your mistakes and failures, okay, what you're doing is you're doubling your problems. Okay, all of us have this self-critic, right, the self-beat-up part of ourselves, right? So when we make a mistake, we experience a failure, what do a lot of us do? We get lost in Facebook. We start watching a Netflix marathon, right? We go off and we beat ourselves up, and we have to spend all of that time dealing with our relationship to the problem, and then we have to also deal with the actual problem, right? So with a growth mindset, you say, hey, you know what? I made a mistake. It didn't work out the way it was supposed to. That has nothing to do with me as a human being. I'm just learning and growing and developing. What can I learn from this, and how can I actually tackle this challenge and overcome it? And save all that time of self-loathing and beat up behind the scenes. So you're actually saving massive amounts of time, and people with growth mindsets, their brains actually light up a different color when they're solving problems. They are much higher performers and much better leaders. So there's a lot of great research that's been done on that. I'm just touching on it today. So again, what's fueling the growth mindset is a feeling of self-compassion. It's an unconditional self-acceptance, a feeling of being whole and complete and perfect, regardless of your perceived successes or failures. And when you operate from that place of self-compassion, it leads to more empathy for yourself and others. You're more rapid in your problem solving, and you have increased mental capacity. All proven by science. Okay, so these are really, really important mindsets. Now, one of my favorite movies is The Matrix. This is why I got Morpheus up here. It's a great movie. If you just listen to that movie, there's so many one-liners in that movie. You're like, wow, this is so profound. But anyways, one of my favorite things he says is that at the end, when Neo finally discovers that he's the one, what Morpheus says to him is, at some point, Neo, you're going to realize that there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. Okay, so all the things that I've just went through today, growth mindset, being of service to people from a selfless service mindset, realizing that your company's bigger than you. We've heard this stuff, right? We've read it in articles, we've read these magazines, blah, blah, it sounds great. It's great knowledge. To actually walk this talk, to live this every single day of your life, that is a whole different ballgame. It's a lifelong journey. It takes continuous practice to go beyond the confines of our self-importance and to operate in this way. Okay, so that's really what we want to inspire people to be able to do. And in doing so, when you're no longer identified with your company, you're kinder to yourself during the normal setbacks and perceived failures. The big power play is to shift into a selfless service mindset. Here's one statement here. I'm here to be of service to humanity and I'm open to receive whatever it is that I'm meant to accomplish in this short life. That covers a lot of what we're talking about here. I'm here to be of service. I'm only here for a short time. How can I do that in the best way possible? When we operate from this place, this is when we're most powerful. This is when our consciousness expands, and we're no longer chained by the suffering of our own minds. All of that suffering that we're talking about is self-inflicted. Okay, so this is the real payoff, is that the entrepreneurial roller coaster, when you start operating from this place, it's less of this big, huge ups and downs. That's very exciting. It's very fun. It's full of adrenaline. But it does lead to burnout, and it does lead to poor decision making. So you can actually have two entrepreneurs facing the exact same market conditions, the exact same challenges. And one of them can be a psychological judo master, completely balanced, going, hey, what can I learn from this? How is this perfect? How can I address this in the best way possible? What's actually the solution that's going to be of most service to my investors, my team members, and our customers, and humanity? And then you can have another entrepreneur who's completely freaking out because their own self-worth is being threatened, and they're trying to hold on to their image and their identity of what they've created for themselves out in the world and out in the press, and not doing what's best for the company, but doing what's best for them. So it's not about changing the external circumstances, it's about changing ourselves. When we start to do that work ourselves, no matter what's going on in the world, we have a choice about how we're showing up to meet it. Okay, this is really, really powerful work for people to do as entrepreneurs. So here's the old game as a quick summary. I am my company, rooted in arrogance, anxiety, rooted in greed, self-beat-up, rooted in pride, to the new game. This company is far bigger than me, operating from a place of selfless service and a growth mindset, coming from these core emotions of humility, generosity, and self-compassion. Which one of these is going to experience greater psychological well-being, and which one of these is going to suffer? Right? It's pretty evident, right? But in order for us to be able to get here, we need to be aware of these parts of ourselves. And it takes deep self-inquiry. It takes a lot of self-awareness. It takes commitment. This is not like, summoning up an Uber cab. Everybody wants a hack, right? In 2 seconds, they want to go from there to there. It actually takes time to be able to change our psychology and change our minds and our neuroplasticity to start operating from a new context. But I can tell you this is way more empowering. It's way higher integrity, and it's way more fun. Okay, so I just want to give one last example here. So we've actually been working with entrepreneurs on this in our breakthrough program, where we combine our scientific measurement, also our immersions and our executive coaching. And we actually did 2 interventions around fear and stress and time management. And out of doing just 2 interventions, they improved in 21 out of 22 categories that we measure scientifically in significant ways. So that's all of the categories there. But here's some of the key ones. So psychological adaptability, the ability to adapt to certain changes, 31% increase. Self-compassion, growth mindset, 24%. Burnout resistance, 17%. Fear and decision making, these are the 2 actual direct interventions we did. And then also there was these indirect outcomes, which was improved emotional intelligence, improved confidence in their fundraising, their product market fit, and their customer growth. So by simply working on the entrepreneur and their own self-awareness, their own personal growth, with no business training whatsoever, they actually came out of this much more confident and executing in a much better way on the core business objectives. So I thought that was pretty cool. So we scientifically measured that. Thank you so much, guys, for your attention. And it's an important topic, and I appreciate you guys hearing me out.